What's going on, folks? Nate here at Tool Dynaworks, and I'm going to make this a really quick video today, but it's an important topic that I want to touch on that I probably don't spend enough time talking about, and I doubt you're going to hear any other tuners, especially for these new 24 MT-09s, discussing it all. And that topic is engine braking. So from the moment you let off the throttle back down to the 0% position on the throttle stop, and how quickly that rear wheel starts decelerating. Now, bone stock, the engine braking mapping on these bikes is not bad by any means. Yamaha does a hell of a lot better job in that department than they do with the rest of the throttle-by-wire mapping. But where you introduce a problem is by disabling the deceleration field cut, which every tuner tuning these bikes is going to do. Because from the factory, Yamaha, and actually every other manufacturer out there on modern motorcycles, essentially treats the injectors like a light switch. So when you are rolling off the throttle, all of a sudden they just shut the injectors down to nothing, mostly for fuel economy and for emissions compliance. But what that does is that once you go off the throttle and the injectors are closed, you start to get back on and creates that jerking, hitchy, weird, twitchy sensation as you go off and on the throttle, and your off-on throttle transition just sucks. But the stock engine braking mapping was never developed for additional fuel to be present while you're decelerating. So now that you're adding additional fuel on deceleration because the injectors are now on and the throttle-by-wire system is hanging the plates open just a few percent, all of a sudden the bike doesn't decelerate nearly as quickly as it did stock when you do that. So what you then have to do, and I say you have to do, I can tell you from experience almost every tuner out there does not do this, but they should, they just don't. What you should do is go back in and modify the ETV opening percentages during the deceleration portion of the mapping. Now, from the factory, this ECU does not have a 0% throttle column. They actually have a completely different table that controls engine braking. So the main ETV table ain't gonna help you. What these ECUs reference is an ETV deceleration table. Now, I'm not going to show you what I've done in Power Mode 1 because I've already been playing with it and modifying it, and I'm not interested in educating our competition. But you can see if I just look at Power Mode 2, there is a pretty stark difference between first and second gear, where you're hanging the throttle open at like 2.6% at 10,000 RPMs, versus the rest of the gears where it's at 2.9, or even right there at 12,000 RPMs, which you're never going to be at on these bikes, but this will be referenced somewhat when you're at 11,000 RPMs, because the ECU interpolates between the 10,000 and the 12,000 RPM value. It's all the way at 4.3%. And you can imagine that if you still are on the gas 4% and there's still fuel being injected into the system, you're not going to decelerate that fast. So shutting off the decel fuel cut really kind of, not ruins, but massively oversoftens the engine braking that these bikes come with from the factory. So the right way to go about modifying these tables is to essentially take a baseline of where the bike decelerated before you fucked with it, before we started tuning it, before you shut off the decel fuel cut, and see what the deceleration times look like in each gear. And this is exactly what we've done here. This is not something you're going to see, again, from literally anybody else out there on these bikes, because I doubt they even know how to do this. But you can actually go ahead and measure deceleration time by each gear on the dyno. So once you've gone ahead and gotten a baseline of how the bike decelerates stock, and then you apply the deceleration fuel cut, or disable the deceleration fuel cut, and you can see how it then decelerates once the additional fuel is in the system while the ETV is open, and then you can start making changes from there and try to get the engine braking back down to where it was before you started fucking with it. And just so you can visualize what I'm talking about, here's a good example. This is fifth gear on this bike, and we are starting at the 0 time mark there down at the bottom at 10,000 RPMs in both runs. Now, the blue line is with the decel fuel cut disabled. It took us 22.5 seconds to decelerate from 10,000 RPMs to 3,500 RPMs with the fuel cut turned off, so disabled. The red line there is the exact same gear, fifth gear, from 10,000 RPMs to 3,500 RPMs, with the decel fuel cut still turned on from the factory. So you can see that the decel fuel cut in fifth gear actually makes this bike take almost 2 seconds longer to decelerate from 10,000 RPMs to 3,500 RPMs. So now that we have that data, then we go ahead and start manipulating that ETV deceleration table and closing down the percentage that the throttle plates are left open at each RPM range that they have defined in that table. And again, you have to do that for every single gear in every single mode. This is not a level of R&D that you're going to see anywhere else, because most other people operating a dyno have absolutely no idea that you can even do this. I've never once seen anybody showing any sort of video or any sort of data or even so much as a fucking negative graph that actually displays deceleration and how tuning can affect that. Which, for the record, is fucking mind-blowing. Because when you're riding these bikes, especially if you're in something like a track environment, you're only on the throttle about half the time. You are off the throttle and on the brakes the same amount of time at somewhere like the Ridge Motorsports Park that you are on the throttle stop. So yeah, tuning the bike while you're accelerating is great, but you then can also completely overhaul how the bike decelerates, which you're spending just as much time doing as you are accelerating. So making these types of measurements is absolutely essential to getting these things properly dialed in, because right now, what most tuners are going to do is just shut off the decel fuel cut, and they're actually over softening the engine braking quite dramatically. That slows down 10% slower, so it takes 10% longer to get from 10,000 RPMs to 3,500 RPMs by just shutting off the decel fuel cut, and this engine braking was already pretty soft to begin with. So, I've gone ahead and actually manipulated those ETV tables in every single gear to get it back to pretty darn close to how the ETV deceleration tables function stock now that there's fuel introduced while the throttle is open. However, you can only do about, I would say, 70 to 80% of the engine braking R&D on the dyno, because there is also some factors that are not accounted for. For example, I am 6'9", so when I'm sitting on this motorcycle, I am a fucking wind sail, and you can't replicate the air drag against somebody's body, especially if you're the size of me, while you're on the throttle stop in the 0% position, and you're decelerating going into a corner. And anybody that claims that they're doing this through road testing is full of shit, because you are not going to ever be in 6th gear all the way at the limiter and then decelerating into a corner on a public road. You could, I guess, if you're willing to just lose your license and get thrown in jail, but it just doesn't happen. There's no professional out there that's willing to risk that, so they're not doing it. Which is why this guy is going to get loaded up into a trailer here shortly, and we're going to the racetrack tomorrow. Because again, all we've done now by measuring deceleration in each gear and then modifying the ETV deceleration table is get this thing back to decelerating how it did before you shut off the decel fuel cut, so before we started tuning it. That doesn't mean we've improved at all the ETV deceleration mapping or how this bike engine brakes into a corner. We've just got it back to where it was before we started fucking with it. It takes testing on a track to go ahead and improve that engine braking mapping, because you just can't do it anywhere else. And not only does it take testing on a racetrack, you kind of need somebody that's pretty fast to be able to give you the appropriate feedback to say whether or not you just made the engine braking better or worse than it was stock. Because it takes a club level or preferably Moto America level rider to be able to actually give you the feedback as to whether or not they're having to over brake into the corner, and they could actually use some assistance from the engine braking to get slowed down to run the appropriate line and then get back on the throttle as they exit the corner. And my personal lap times up the ridge will give us a pretty good idea of that, but I'm only, at least according to last year's times, somewhere in the top 10 if you were to compare like Super Hooligan lap times from Moto America to what I ran out there a couple of years ago on a pretty much stock KTM Duke 890R. Yeah, sure, I'm in the top 10, so I'm certainly not slow, but I'm far from a true pro. So not only do I take all these bikes that we buy and build mapping for out there to the track to go ahead and develop this mapping, I then throw legitimate pro riders on there to get their feedback and dial it in from there. We're fortunate enough here to have the majority of the track records in the Northwest and British Columbia because we sponsor a ton of truly professional riders that are more than happy to throw a leg over our new bikes every time we get them and just go have some fun and let us know what works, what sucks, what needs improvement, or what is bang on dialed in when we're done. So, again, that's why we're loading this guy up into a trailer here shortly. We will be doing all that on-track testing this weekend with track time out at the Ridge Motorsports Park, and we're going to go have a great fucking time while we get this thing properly dialed in and really optimize the engine braking mapping so this thing just goes into a corner perfectly. And yes, obviously we'll be data logging, fuel mapping, and everything else while we're out there because that's just kind of 101 for properly tuning these bikes. On a bike like this, I'm actually less concerned about fuel volume and data logging on the track because it's not a Ram Air bike. So there's nothing that is pushing additional air charge into the intake. So the dyno is actually a great tool to get the fuel mapping dialed in. We're probably going to see 2 or 3% trims, and that's it. That's generally what we see on all the naked bikes with no Ram Air effect. But again, we'll still log the data anyway and make appropriate changes because, well, I want things perfect. And now my short video is no longer a short video, and I have like 4 appointments today for dyno tuning, and I'm sure there's already a stack of ECUs out there, so I gotta go. But if you guys have any questions about getting your new 24 MT-09 properly tuned and dialed in, do not hesitate to reach out. Our email is support@tooldynoworks.com, and we are always happy to help answer any of your questions about this new platform and how to get it properly tuned and dialed in.